So how does my daughter? So her name is Mara, and she was born in 2013. So she's about 11 years old now. We thought it was going to be a normal, birth and everything. And when she was born, she kind of got stuck. And usually when a baby's born, you hear like a lot of crying and all that kind of stuff, and there wasn't any noise at all. So we were like, what's going on? And they were like, oh, she's out. And I was like, okay, why isn't she crying? And so she had to be intubated immediately. And so my prayer was really just, God, we don't know what's happening, but we just want her to live. Like spare her life, and we'll do whatever we have to do to take care of her and love her. And God answered that prayer. And so she was born with cerebral palsy, and essentially she cannot walk, she can't talk, she can't feed herself. She's tube fed through her stomach, and so she's in a wheelchair. So she's doing well. She's healthy, and she's living in our house, and we're caring for her now. And it's been a little bit of a journey, but we're happy to be a family and have her with us, and yeah.
In 1989, my wife was pregnant with our youngest daughter, and she contracted a autoimmune disease and started bleeding out of her lungs. And it was about the week before Thanksgiving in 1989, and so I took her to the hospital. In fact, I walked in on that Sunday night, coming back from church, and she was coughing up blood. And the next morning, we got to the hospital as soon as we could, and the doctors began to run tests and figured out what was going on. And within a couple of days, they took a probe into my wife's lungs and came back and said, we don't know why she's bleeding. We don't know how to stop it. All we can tell you is that there's a really good chance that if she doesn't stop bleeding soon, the first thing that's going to happen is that she's going to miscarry your little baby, and your baby's going to die. And I'll never forget, the doctor came to me and says, look, we think we know what's going on. They got something back from the Mayo Clinic, and the test showed that Debbie had what was called Wegener's disease. And he said, we're going to have to give her massive doses of chemotherapy. But if we do, you're going to have to sign for that. And I thought, sign for that? Why am I going to sign for that? And he said, because, David, there's a possibility that this could influence or impact your baby, even kill your baby. We don't know. I remember I walked out in the hall, and I just began to pray. Nurses kind of gathered around, and I was crying, and just I went over and signed that piece of paper. I went in and put my hands on Debbie's stomach, and I felt the baby kick for the next several hours while they gave her first dose of chemo, and just praying for her and just holding on to her. And anyway, long story short was that was Wednesday evening. On Thursday, I just got to the point I couldn't go at all. That Thursday night, I went home and laid down in the back of my apartment, and I prayed like I've never prayed in my whole life. It was one of the most life-changing moments next to my salvation I've ever had. I just prayed there, and it just, for probably hours, and it felt like all of a sudden God just filled up that room with his presence, and I felt this sense of just a peace that came over me. And I thought things would get better, and I went back to the next day, and Debbie contracted a blood clot. On Friday, they had to do emergency surgery. They didn't think she would live through surgery. Anesthesiologist said she was the most unstable patient they'd ever worked on. And an hour and a half after she went into surgery, she was back in that room. We found out later on that there were literally thousands of people across the United States that heard about our story that we had no clue about, that they were praying for her. And so the next day, I went to lunch with my former church. They came to visit us. When I came back after lunch, we heard an emergency call to go to respiratory care. I ran down the hall, and Debbie's mom was outside just looking in. She couldn't run in. She was scared to. And I ran in Debbie's room. There were probably 20 people around her. And I backed out of the room in the hallway and stood there. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know if Debbie was dying. I didn't know what had happened. And I found out later on that about 30 minutes before this, they had Debbie on they were putting her on a bedpan because she had an infection. So they went to pull the catheter out. When they did, her mucus plug came out. And so the nurse was the only one there that had any neonatal experience. And by the way, she was filling in for her regular nurse. I think by God's sovereignty, by God's plan, he just put her there. She knew exactly what to do. She ran out and says, you need to call the neonatal care people. The baby's coming. And sure enough, for no better way to put it, basically Debbie miscarried that baby into a bedpan. And I stood out there in the hall 30 minutes later when it wheeled out a little incubator, and inside of it was a 1 pound, 15 ounce, just 14-inch long little baby girl. Debbie was able to go home from the hospital miraculously about 3 weeks later. That's just a whole other story. But Kara didn't go home from the hospital for 2.5 months. When she went home from the hospital, she weighed right at 5 pounds. She did not sit up for basically almost, goodness gracious, for about a year or so, almost a year. She didn't walk until she was 4.5 years old, and they put leg braces on her, and she was able to do some walking. We didn't find out until she was about 4 that Kara had mild cerebral palsy.
So the name of my disability is called cerebral palsy, and it was diagnosed at a very young age. I would say about 2. Overall, my experience in the church has been pretty good. So my home church in Richmond, I was raised there. I went through the whole program. I felt loved and cared for, and it was a good experience. And being able to come back now, we have a media production team, and I was able to fit right in. I was like, hey, I go to school for this. Like, I can help y'all. And they were like, okay. And the first day that I was able to come back and serve was really cool because they just put me on a position. And at the end of the service, they were like, wow, you knew what you were doing. And I was like, yeah, I go to school for this. And they're like, you're kidding me. And it was really funny because all of the people on the broadcast team like knew my dad, but they didn't really know me. But they like knew me because I was raised there. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic. My favorite broadcast experience so far was the day that I was coming back for this spring semester. I was technical director for our broadcast, and about halfway through the service, the director's like, hey, Steven, you want to direct this one? And I'm like, heck yeah, I do. And so he was originally going to let me be TD and direct at the same time. I was like, that's going to take away the fun from somebody else. So we swapped seats, and I was able to direct for the last 30 minutes of the service. I was like, that is something that I can look back on and be like, I did that. And that is by far the coolest thing that I've done.
It's almost like cut out the word with disability. Is ministering to families important? And then it becomes even more of a no-duh. And then the question would be, why, if we're going to minister to all families, why wouldn't families with disabilities fit in that? But now the danger is a lot of churches will say, yeah, we're here for them, but they're not here. Which then that gets to the point of trying to figure out where they are, But it's important because we should be ministering to all people. I've heard it said there's no asterisks in the Great Commission. Like we reach people of all backgrounds and abilities and, all different walks of life. And so we should be working to care for and reach families that are affected by disability in the same way we would or as much as we would other families. So and it's biblical. And I would even say we could go into a lot of reasons why, biblically, why people affected by disability. Well, let me use Christ. I'm not going to give an exact verse, but you see Christ leaning in to those that are affected by disability. You see him ministering to them. I do think actually John 9, when his disciples actually make an assumption that somebody's blind because somebody sinned. And Jesus says, no, he's not blind because of sin. He's blind so that God's glory can be shown through this. Or even Paul, when Paul says, I think it's in Corinthians, when he talks about the thorn in his flesh. And he says, I asked God to take it away. And God said, no, because my power is made perfect in weakness. I mean, even the made perfect is the same phrase that it is finished when Christ says it on the cross. So that tetelestai, it's kind of the same root word. And I'm not saying it's saying the same thing, but the made perfect, it's almost is completed. My power, not that God's power is incomplete ever, but it's like you see a completeness in Christ as he works through those that the world would deem weaker.
I was at a church in Roanoke a while back, and there's a girl there that was about 15 years old. She had Down syndrome. And I'm sitting there with her mother, and I'm watching this girl out in the middle of the court, and all these kids are running around, and her mother's crying. She says, they don't even know she's there. Guys, if Jesus created us in his image, and he created all of us in his image, then he knows we are here. The church should know whoever's there, and they should treat them with integrity and love as if Jesus were the one right there with them, because Jesus would treat them that way. So to the church, I just simply say, man, humanize people. Don't stare. Humanize people. Love them. Care for them. Love for those families. Care for those families. If they need help, help them. But more than anything, those families need for you to include them into the fellowship of the church, where they can feel like they can feel like they're a part of something bigger than themselves. I was in a restaurant in Fort Worth, and I was walking to the bathroom one day, the Mexican restaurant, and there's a little girl there, who's probably 7 or 8 years old. My daughter was about the same age, and she was in a wheelchair. And I just walked up, put my arm around the back of her, and I said, hey, I just want to meet the prettiest girl in this whole place. Her mom and dad stared at me like I was funny. I could, what are you talking about our daughter for? I looked at them, I said, hello, my name's David Wheeler. It's so nice to meet you guys. I said, what's your daughter's name? How old is she? They told me, and I said, I have a daughter very similar to us. I said, my daughter has cerebral palsy. They said, yeah, that's what she has. I said, well, tell me her story. I really want to hear that. And so they just started telling me her story. And when they did, mom and dad got real animated and smiling. Their daughters over smiling from ear to ear about all this and tell me this and stuff, And then I looked at them and I said, I just got a question to ask you. I said, where do y'all go to church? And they said, well, we used to go. You probably don't want to know about that. I said, yeah, I actually do. They said, well, we used to go to a church near us, and said, our daughter attends a public school, and she's mainstreamed into a third grade class in a public school system. Said, but every time we took her to the third grade Sunday school class, we'd have to go pick her up in the nursery because the teacher there would have her wheel back to the nursery every week rather than let her stand in class. And the question they asked was really, I think, good. They said, how can she be mainstreamed into a secular third grade classroom, but she can't be mainstreamed into third grade church classroom? Something's just wrong. And so so many parents have been treated that way. Someone has Tourette's and they make noises. Well, they're interrupting our worship service. No. When I hear a baby cry in a church service, that's life. That means there's a baby there that's going to give life to the future of that church. Cry all you want. That's okay. We get so sensitive to those kind of things. Someone may have an issue or because they talk in the middle of the service with their family member, they don't know or whatever, but just be loving and be gracious and be kind and love that family and reach that family, and so, we've had pretty good experiences pretty much all the way through, particularly through church. But I know some people that haven't had as good experiences. And what ends up happening is when they have one experience like that, it's very difficult to get them back.
I think the problem is that we don't ask questions. I mean, that's really the big thing. And we don't truly try to hear and see where someone's coming from. I don't think that's just with disability. I think that's just across the board. We tend to think we already know what needs to happen. The extreme example I would give is, if a church gave my son noise canceling headphones for a service, that's a waste of time because he needs a ramp. But if someone on the autism spectrum comes to our church who has sensory needs that loud music bothers them, then giving them a ramp is useless as well. So if we just ask questions and we lovingly walk through things and try to figure out how can we care for you, how can we encourage you, if someone comes to faith in Christ, how can we walk with them in community? Those are things that are very effective. And so if people are able to do those things, then they can serve people living with disability. Now, I do understand there's also sometimes there's very specific things that are needed, special skills in certain situations. But a lot of times, just being willing to be there and ask good questions and then serve a family and meet them where they are is enough.
I would say in general, as a church family, the main thing is just treat their family like any other family. That's in line with where the scriptures talk about bearing with one another in love. Sometimes we have to bear with each other's bad attitudes or each other's quirks or whatever. But in this situation, it's a child or somebody in their family who's different than everyone else, and so we can certainly be patient with them and try to be understanding with them.
It's so easy for us to look at a human being and see what they don't have, or what somebody can't do. And I think with people with disability, that's the first step. You see my son and you say, oh, he can't walk. Okay, but what can he do? And so, I think of different groups and different people with different disabilities, that there are things that they do so much better than I do. But no one ever looks at those because sometimes they're minimized. I think of those that are or that have Down syndrome, that have Downs, that they, a lot of times, I feel like many times there's such great love from those in the Down syndrome community, and I've always wondered if they just have love. I have the disability of love. I'm disabled when it comes to true just love for others, and they have the better ability, if that makes sense. And when I get to heaven, it'll be like, oh, they were doing a lot better with that. God had blessed them with this ability that I was missing, if that makes sense.
Disability ministry is a really interesting thing to deal with in the church, because a lot of people settle for pity instead of sympathy or empathy. And I think it's really important that the members of the church need to find in what ways they're doing that and how they can be better. Because we're not perfect, but I know for a fact that just because somebody may have a limitation or their life is different than yours does not mean that pity is necessary.
I think the hardest things that we deal with are attitudinal things. It's the attitude that we have, towards this. I mean, it's one thing when we build a ramp and we do this, but when they get into the church, how do we treat them? Do we treat them, those people with disabilities, like they're second class? Like I've taken care of restaurants where people have heard her because she has a speech impediment, and the person waiting on her would go, "Okay, honey, what do like that?" And no, don't do that. Don't treat that. Treat people with integrity, with character. Treat their family that way.
Most people respond to someone with special needs in one of two ways. They either ignore them because they're not really sure what to do, and they're just kind of move on with their day, or they point them out, right? And they're like, oh, that's so weird, or what's going on with that person, or and I think those are both natural things that are just human instincts, because people don't know what to do. They feel strange and they're not sure how to act around somebody with special needs, and so just helping those people. I would say ministering to the people with special needs, but I think also ministering to the people who interact with those people, to help them see like, hey, this person has a soul too, and I don't think most people are trying to offend our family or her at all. They just don't understand, especially kids. Like we'll have little kids come up to her and be like, why isn't she, what's wrong with her? Why isn't she talking or whatever? And, we try to explain to them in a helpful way. But most people, they just don't know, and they're just trying to understand and learn as much as they can.
Yeah. I mean, I think it goes back sort of to the question before. But but it's just how do we show love to people? How do we hear where they are? In some ways, I think a lot of these questions, even if you took the word disabilities out of it, like how would you help someone who has church hurt? And it seems like the steps would be to listen, to hear them, to help them understand that you are hearing where they're coming from, and that you want to walk through with them, and that where they are, you want to be with them and walk with them so that they can be part of the church. If it's somebody who's heard it secondhand, say that, I mean, just be honest that yes, at times the church has hurt a lot of people. Unintentionally or intentionally at times, different churches have, but that we, whoever we is, want to love and care for you and encourage you, and walk through it with you, so just somebody needs to know you care. And so it just takes time to see that.
The church and Jesus has changed everything. Really, the community and brotherhood that I had, having a good local church, that is so important, because a good local church will not only be a good place for people who need help to come through, which we all need help, but also training people to go out. And every week I feel so encouraged to go to Heritage. I'm like, man, what are we going to learn today? And it's so important because the devil knows that when we're alone, he has a better chance of getting in our heads. And when we're united together in the body of Christ, which is the church, it's almost impossible to take us down.
Kara was in the 9th grade, and there were 2 girls in the 9th grade there who called her one day and called her all kinds of just nasty names, making fun of her. Left her a message on the phone. She knew who the 2 girls were. And I said, Kara, do you want me to call their parents? No, I don't want you to do that. Well, do you want me to talk to the girls? Because they rode in the same bus. And she said, no, Dad, I'll take care of this. I mean, Kara's about 4 foot, I don't know, 4'10" at that time, something like that, And so this little girl, she goes out, and I watch her, goes out there, and those girls get off the bus, and I see her pointing her finger at those little girls when they get off the bus. And I asked her, I said, what did you tell them? She said, I told them, you don't have to like me, but you will respect me. And one of the cool stories of that is one of those girls never admitted she did it. The other girl did. And that girl, Kara didn't knock those kids out of her life. What Kara did was she still loved them. And one of those girls, about 2 years later, her mother died. Kara stayed in her life, and Kara got to see that her friend come to Christ. She got to share the gospel with her and see her friend come to Christ. I'll tell you this, I had a student in my class years ago. His name was Ricky. Ricky was about 3.5 foot tall. He had a disability, rode a wheelchair around campus. And one of the guys told me, Ricky shared his testimony in class, and everybody just fell in love with him. And so one of the guys in class told me, he came in when I'd shared in the class about disabilities, and he came and told me, he says, I took Ricky out to a movie this weekend, just to be really nice. I thought I would bless him. He said, but actually, Ricky blessed me. I said, how's that? He said, every girl around wants to talk to Ricky. He said, I've never met so many girls in all my life. He says, I want to go out with Ricky again. And Ricky just, all the cheerleaders, everybody wanted to hang around with Ricky. And so he told me, he says, he's the coolest guy I've ever met in my life. And so often you'd think, I want to do something for Ricky. And actually, you hang out with Ricky, Ricky will do something, he makes you feel better. Ricky don't look at himself as being disabled. Ricky just looks at himself as created in the image of God, and he's going to make the very best of what he can. And, in fact, Ricky came up to me in class one day about a month or 2 after. He says, hey, would you ever like me to come talk to the guys in class and kind of help them learn how to talk to girls? Oh, man. We had a family. We were in Ohio. We had a family in Ohio. It's one of my daughter's coaches, my oldest daughter's softball coaches. They had a daughter named Emily. And Emily had some severe disability for cerebral palsy, and we would just go and love on her. When they would have birthday parties for her, man, we showed up for birthday parties for her. We'd get her stuff and do things for her. And Debbie would always be there to help mom and dad and that kind of thing. And we loved on Steve and the dad. And Steve watched Kara love on Emily and love on everybody else. And after a couple of years, Steve he went off to a weekend retreat. And this, if I best remember, he went to this retreat with a church. And he said, I had to deal with a lot of bitterness I had over Emily and the way things have happened. He said, then I realized that Emily is not a burden, she is a blessing. And by the way, Steve eventually got saved. Just walking with the Lord. You know what he said? He said, you know how that happened? He said, I watched Kara. I watched how she treated and how she was. And I realized that God created all this and how much of a blessing Emily was to Kara and everybody else around, and that makes a big difference when we start thinking about, what that looks like.
In John 9, the story of the man who was born blind, and everybody in the town was talking. They're like, well, who sinned that this man was born blind? And Jesus' response was, no one sinned. He was born blind so that the glory of God may be shown in his life.
Man, wake up. Look for opportunities to love people in the name of Jesus. And what you'll find out is God will open doors for the gospel. And as he does that, you'll see those people come to Christ. Because if Jesus were here, he would love them. We need to go do the same.